This is the Richman Center Public Lecture Series, and the topic today is cyber threats and cybersecurity. And in case you're really not up to speed on the topic, take a look at the New York Times today, front page article on this very issue. I think if you read through that, it'll give you some interesting understanding of what's going on in the world today and why we're here tonight. Maybe we'll learn a little bit more about this topic from other aspects with our lecture tonight. But take a look at that article. On behalf of the Richman Center, a joint venture of the law school and the business school, welcome to this lecture. I'm Jesse Greene. I'm senior fellow at the Richman Center. We foster debate and a dialogue on emerging policy questions and where the business and markets intersect with the law. Our goal is to promote evidence-based public policy. This is a series of lectures that we've been running. We're in our second year now. This evening's topic involves just about everyone in some manner. The consequences have a wide range of impacts on national defense, on businesses, on public markets, and to each of us individually. Our ever-increasing reliance on computing power and networks is what is making this so important. So what are the vulnerabilities in the technology? What can technology companies do about it? And when? What damage is being done? And what kind of cases is the government bringing to help protect us? And what can and should the government do by public policy actions and regulation in this area? To help us understand this and give us some insights into these various questions, we have an outstanding panel this evening. We have Judith Germano. She is chief of the Economic Crimes Unit in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of New Jersey. She has been with that office since 2002 and has supervised and prosecuted complex criminal matters, including securities fraud, corporate and bank fraud, computer crimes, identity theft, and many other crimes, including matters impacting national security. She has been an instructor at the FBI training conferences, the Department of Justice National Advocacy Center, and universities and private sector conferences. Before the Department of Justice, she worked at Sherman & Sterling and clerked for the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and the U.S. District Court for the District of Connecticut. She holds a JD degree from St. John's University School of Law and a BS degree from Cornell. We're also pleased to have Brendan Hannigan with us from IBM. He is General Manager of IBM's Security Systems Division in the IBM Software Group. This division of IBM brings together IBM's capabilities to respond to risks with comprehensive and integrated approaches to enterprise security. Before IBM, Brendan was the president and CEO of Q1 Labs. The acquisition of Q1 Labs by IBM catalyzed the creation of IBM's Security Systems Division. Brendan has also been with Sockeye Networks, Forrester Research, and other major tech firms. He is a computer science graduate from University College, Dublin, Ireland. And with us also from the law school is Matthew Waxman. He is the faculty co-chair of the Roger Hertog Program on Law and National Security at the Columbia Law School. He is an expert on national security law and international law, specializing in domestic and international terrorism. Is this terrorism we're dealing with, Matthew?
Sometimes.
He was a Fulbright Scholar and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He has served in the State Department and has clerked for the Supreme Court and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. He holds a JD degree from Yale University. Thanks to all of you for participating tonight. I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion. Let's get to it. Brendan, would you help us understand a little bit on the technology side about where we are and where is this all going?
Sure. Thank you very much, Jesse. Good evening, everybody. Best way, I think, to kick off the discussion is to think of it as an analogy. And security in the cyber world and the threats in the cyber world are just it's a new vector in the world that's no different than the vectors that we have in the physical world and how they've evolved over time. And if you think of the risks that we've faced now and what has changed now versus in the past, there's always a pendulum that swings back and forth between security and between people being able to get past those defenses, and then we figure out new ways to defend against those particular risks, and the pendulum swings back into the favor of the good people, and then the pendulum swings back and forth. And that happens all the time. I mean, it happens in the physical world, it happens in policing in cities, and it's clearly happening now in cybersecurity, and it actually has been happening since the first days of computing. If some of you wouldn't remember it, but there's, in the mid-90s, replicating email worms went all around Microsoft Office systems all over the world and brought Windows systems to their knees all over the world. And it was a simple email which people clicked on because it said, "I love you," and they clicked on it, and everybody's computers became infected. And all over the world, computer systems were down for a couple of days while that was cleaned up. And that was 15 years ago. And of course, there was ways to get past that. So what's different right now at this point in time? Well, this particular swing in the pendulum is particularly severe, and I'll talk about why some of those things have changed. But let me draw an analogy. If we look back a few hundred years, I'm from Ireland originally, and if anybody who's been on vacation to Ireland or Scotland and you drive around the countryside, there's castles absolutely everywhere, right? There's these beautiful old castle walls. And they were invented as a way to protect families and communities from a particular type of threat. And then people, as the threat evolved and people built scaffolding or ladders to get up onto the castle wall, people would build higher castle walls. They'd build moats around the castle. They'd put flaming oil down the side of the castle. And so there was always a modification to a protection mechanism, which was pretty solid. A castle, make it wider, make it higher, put a river around it, pour burning oil on it. Well, the analogy of what's kind of happening right now in our world, it's like having those castle walls and then all of a sudden a helicopter comes out of nowhere and just lands in the middle of that castle. Those protections that people have put in place and relied upon for years and years and years just aren't effective for the types of threats which we face today. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and it explains why this has become much more heightened at this point in time. To see the result, at IBM, we have a sort of vast set of technologies which we bring to bear in the marketplace, but also we help customers manage security. We've got data centers all over the world where we're monitoring what's happening in some of our customers' environments. And we're able to capture as well, fairly statistically across these various different customers, what's actually happening, and then look at the threats which have occurred and try to get to the root cause of what actually happened. What this graphic is trying to show is just, it's our attempt to show the basic impact, which is the size of the bubble of a particular type of threat, and the frequency of it. These are publicly released. For every publicly released weakness, there's clearly going to be many which are kept more private, more within an industry, or more within a company. And then as we learn, at the trail end, these are gray because it takes a while to actually know the exact cause of a particular threat. But as we get to know, they're color-coded based on the nature of the threat itself. So for example, right now, there's not a lot coded red, but in that red color is called a distributed denial of service attack. So banks in the United States, up to a few weeks ago, were really being heavily attacked by a distributed denial of service attack coming from various different places. Actually, a distributed denial of service attack by definition is thousands or tens of thousands of computers around the world attacking a particular site. It's distributed. The intent is to deny service to that particular website or that particular web service. What's remarkable about the nature of these different types of challenges is, and some of you probably don't know the gory details and you don't need to, how do these weaknesses and how do attackers get past weaknesses? Ultimately, it's a weakness in how software or how the systems are configured, or it's actually a flaw in the software itself, which allows a malicious piece of software or a malicious operator to get access to something they shouldn't get access to. So for example, nearly every piece of software is highly networked and gets access to databases. And so that software has mechanisms to call into to get information from those databases. And that's important. Every single time we go and do anything in the world right now, we're retrieving information, we're depositing information, we're running transactions. Well, what happens if there's a flaw in that software where somebody can basically trick it to start making calls that it shouldn't be making, which allow somebody to see information in a database they shouldn't be able to see? That's actually an example of a well-known attack which has been well-known for many, many years. It's called an SQL injection attack, where a piece of software gets access into a database, gets access to that information that it shouldn't get access to. And in this world that we live in, we have built some of the most remarkable, incredible systems you could ever imagine in terms of the value they deliver to companies and to consumers. But guess what? They're complex systems. Complex, multi-dimensional, highly integrated systems where there's multiple different people involved. Somebody makes a mistake like that, it creates a problem which allows somebody else to get access to it. There's actually ways to address some of these problems. That's what's remarkable. In some of these cases, it's not even a question of technology missing to help identify the weakness. It's the reality inside complex organizations as to whether or not our companies have gotten to all the steps necessary to put the protections in place to protect against these weaknesses. The other thing that's changed in our world is the nature of the attackers have changed. So that email replicating virus from the 1990s is a great example of what we would traditionally have called a hacker, right? It's pretty hard to describe some of the most recent, highly publicized breaches inside companies, inside the New York Times, inside some of the examples I have earlier as hackers. I mean, that is very concerted, specific intent to actually steal information, create a denial of service, to create risk for a business, to actually try and disrupt a business. It's very specific. A lot of the times in the past, the intent was notoriety for the person. The most risky attacks which our customers are facing these days is not just worried about the person who wants notoriety by defacing a website or wants to get publicity. It's in fact the most concerning thing are the attackers who nobody ever hears about and who we never see. And so with all, it's kind of interesting, the article in the newspaper this morning in the New York Times, which is a specific story about attacking and hacking of the New York Times. But in reality, many of our customers have been living this for a long time, and they know about it. Security people inside organizations, inside government, and inside businesses know about this. And their biggest worry, in fact, is also just those threats which they just don't know where they're coming from, or they don't know what the intent is. So what's changed over time in terms of this particular pendulum swing, on the one hand, because of the changing nature and technology, because of the complexity of how our systems are being connected together, because of the incredible reliance, which is in reality a really good thing because the value we get out of it, of all of these systems being connected together, has created more risk. And then on the other hand, a whole series of people, and it's not just nation states, it's organized crime. It's specific criminals, maybe they're in California, and they've realized if you want to rob a bank, if you go down to your local bank in your town, how much money are you going to find in the vault these days? Where's all the money? It's online. You can get, if you've got a sophisticated ring initiating financial fraud through transfers or whatever mechanisms that they have, that's basically where criminals will go. If somebody wants to steal intellectual property because they're a competitor, where are they going to go? They're not going to go trolling through the trash in the garbage containers as they're pulling away. They're just not going to do that. They're going to try and get online. And the difference in terms of sophisticated attack, and the reason why the world is different now than it was even 5 years ago, is in the past, companies, and because of the different nature of the attackers, were crafting attacks in a kind of general sense, looking for software vulnerabilities in general against Microsoft email, like that virus I talked about in the mid-90s. And now it's a little bit different. Now they're crafting attacks against specific companies where those attacks have never been seen before, where the types of software they're using to try and penetrate an organization has never been seen before. They don't want it to have been seen before. They don't want the systems to detect these types of threats. What they're doing is they're picking an organization, whether it be a state or a company, for a particular reason. Maybe it's for financial gain. Maybe it's because they want to create disruption. Maybe it's for competitive information. And then they basically will target that company, and that may take a month. It may take 18 months. What the cost is a few people sitting in a remote country getting access to botnets, getting access to other pieces of software with a very specific intent and purpose. So it's a very different world that we all live in as it relates to this type of crime and the type of threat which our customers face. So if you wonder why these news articles are showing up at this particular point in time, it is the intersection of those two things. Very different nature of technology and how we use it. Very different nature in terms of the type of people and the type of entities which are attacking us. So everything from, yes, the script kiddies are still out there, but we have organized crime. We've got people who are, beyond notoriety. They don't want to just get names. They want to help destroy a business, or they want to disrupt a business for whatever reason that they have. They're disaffected. They are not, satisfied with the political process. They want to damage a business. And then, of course, there's nation states as well. Here's briefly what our customers, if you look at what a customer has to deal with, when I get my thing right here. There was a time when we had simple applications, if we look at the data center, our PCs and our laptops, and actually in those days of limited communications and relatively limited networking, this castle approach to security and this perimeter approach to security was effective. Now, of course, customers have to deal with lots more infrastructure, right? There's mobile, there's data in the cloud, data in, some of our, a lot of our data is stored by cloud service providers who are delivering a service of providing that data to companies. Companies rely upon that increasingly more. And while it's a big, it has been a concern, I think over time people will see it actually as a great opportunity to centralize security around that data over time. But even beyond that, just consider all of the complexity that sits on top of these systems. For those of you who are not as familiar with technology, the reality is in any one of these systems, in any reasonable sized company or government agency, there are literally thousands of applications delivering different functions, different automation inside it, even a small or medium-sized organization. Hundreds of applications inside those organizations, a large multinational, thousands or tens of thousands of applications. With data exploding, you all know what's happening in your own homes, with your photos, with your emails, with your Twitters, with your this, with your that, right? Now imagine what's happening inside a business. And the data that was sensitive in the past, which is still sensitive, was structured transactional data. For example, data coming in and out of the database on a mainframe with those financial transactions. But now there's so much unstructured data, emails, Twitter feeds, which may have sensitive key pieces of information about our customers, critical for the future as well, and we have to deal with all of that. And then, of course, on top of it, we have this incredible richness of connectivity that's occurring between all of our software systems and processes, and this is what our customers have to protect against. So what's happening as we look to the future? The reality is there's a ton and a lot of innovation that's happening in this area, and there's actually a lot of approaches which our customers can take and are taking to help protect against this. And like in anything, there's different companies that are at a different, companies and governments and individuals even are at a different stage in this voyage as to where they are. But one of the key capabilities which we can bring to bear and which we are bringing to bear increasingly are new technologies which allow us to really understand the activity associated with this unusual behaviors which could be as a result of threatening activity. The reason why this is so important is in the past, a lot of security technologies were about blocking known threats against an attacker who's using well-known attack techniques. And as a new attack is found over an XYZ company, you built up your defense against that. It's like building up your castle wall, and now you're safe even though that person may be the first one to get hit. In the world of a targeted threat, the threat coming at your organization is in fact brand new, never been seen before. It's just for you, just packaged especially for your organization or your government agency or whatever. So how do you detect that? Well, you detect it no different than if, some unusual person was walking around the business school here in Columbia and they started opening up different people's offices and just opening up filing cabinets. Somebody would put a little trigger and go, hang on a second, that's unusual. This person doesn't belong here. What's going on? That's the equivalent of what actually we are leveraging in the digital world with some really remarkable technologies, which also have to deal with the question of privacy, which I know we will talk about as well, but can in fact these attacks that happen, they don't happen at 9 o'clock in the morning and an attack starts even from an organized criminal or from a state, and then 9:05 it's done, the data's gone, somebody just stole the designs of the plane. It just doesn't happen that way. No different than when somebody did a heist in a bank 100 years ago. It just doesn't happen that way, right? It takes months of planning. It takes a lot of scaling. It takes actually a lot of time and effort to get into an environment and start trying to figure out where the data is and walk around. Well, that's what we have to use our technology to be able to capture the kind of business process or the process inside a government agency which nobody on the outside can really ever know, and then be able to trigger on that unusual activity. And we're able to do that very successfully with incredible, high-powered, sophisticated analytics that we're able to apply to say, yes, we communicate with that particular geography, but you know what? That was an unusual, single, outbound connection from the revenue recognition analysts and their PC to a particular computer in Bulgaria that we never, ever communicate with. That's very unusual. And that's a tiny, tiny piece of information lost within billions of pieces of information. But by the application of analytics, you can catch that, and then basically you're able to trigger on these unusual behaviors. And that's where we're moving in the technology industry, the application of analytics at all different aspects of our technology lifecycle to be able to detect these unusual behaviors. So that's my big, my brief kind of tour through where we are. And to summarize before I hand it over to Judith, our world has changed, there's no question. The motivation of the folks attacking us totally changed. The incredible explosion in terms of how we use these technologies, the infusion of the internet, not just in terms of how we connect ourselves, our companies, but all of the things which we do together, has also changed how these applications are being stitched together. That is resulting in articles like what we saw in the New York Times this morning. It's a particularly sort of challenging time in terms of that swing of the pendulum. However, we're working very hard on a whole set of technologies which we can apply to help companies and organizations and government agencies to be able to get a handle on this from a technology perspective. So now I'll hand it over to Judith. Thank you.
Well,
I appreciate you all coming out tonight. And preparing for this talk has been a little bit interesting because, as Jesse mentioned, we had the New York Times article this morning. I actually get the news feeds, so I got it last night that there was a big article on the recent hacks, and it referenced the Mandiant survey that gives a little bit more meat that came out today. So I was trying to read that so I could come and be sufficiently informed. And as I was sitting outside before I had the courage to find a working umbrella in my car to come to find my way to this building, I got an email that Apple had been hacked. And they were hacked with the same problem that Facebook had just last week, where they said, yeah, we've been hacked, but don't worry, it's not a problem. So I applaud you all for coming out on this dark and stormy night to learn about what is indeed a very cutting-edge issue and ever-changing. And one of the challenges we have is that the people who are doing it are really, really smart, as are you, of course. But they're really good at what they do, and they're really persistent. And so it's ever-changing. And one of the issues we have in law enforcement is trying to understand it, keep up with it, preferably keep ahead of it. And it's not something that the government can do alone. It's really something that requires coordination between the government and the private sector in terms of addressing the problem, because the issues are so cutting edge and the people who are doing it are so persistent, as Brendan said, for a lot of different motivations, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we have organized cybercrime is replacing terrorism as the #1 threat to America. That's what the FBI Director Robert Mueller said this spring. Panetta also talked about that. And we see that it is indeed a real problem. And the cyber threat to critical infrastructure is growing and represents one of the most serious national security challenges we can confront. That was the executive order that the president just issued last week on February 12th, and addressing the problem as well. And the question that we really have is, are we doing enough? And I think one of the things that we can look at is they're talking about cyber as being the next 9/11 problem, but there are certain issues that we had pre-9/11 that we're seeing again in the cyber realm. One is companies don't want to admit when they've been hacked, because if they admit that they've been hacked, they're showing that they're vulnerable, and then they're concerned that people will come in and try to hack them before they fix the problem. They're concerned about the effect in their stock price, and they're concerned about what else has gone out the door before they've gotten their arms on the issue. And that was something pre-9/11 where companies didn't want to admit that they were vulnerable. And if we go back earlier, there were companies that didn't want to admit that they had shoplifters, because then they were afraid that they would be the store where the shoplifters said, oh, well, that's a good place to go. We can steal from them. And the companies, going to the shoplifting analogy, got together and said, you know what? We have to just stop this. And they posted signs, no shoplifting, and it became something that people were comfortable talking about. Post 9/11, it became something we all had to talk about, that we were all vulnerable to attack, and what were we going to do about it? And now the cyber world, their discussion really is shifting, where companies more and more are being open about admitting when they're attacked. And it's no longer a shock, quite frankly, because it's in the news so often. But one of the other things that we learned pre-9/11 was that there was an issue of people not talking enough and people not coordinating enough. It was an issue in government. It was an issue in the private sector. And that's also something that we're working on and working to combat in addressing the cyber problem. And I think the government, the president's executive order last week was sending a message about that very much in terms of encouraging companies to talk. And there have been issues about whether there should be legislation or further rulemaking. But then, of course, there's the concern about hindering business and productivity. And in fact, in the balance, the executive order and the opening policy statements talk about, on one hand, we want to encourage efficiency, innovation, and economic prosperity. And on the other hand, there's safety and security issues, business confidentiality, privacy, and civil liberties. And of course, that's always the age-old problem, right, of freedom versus national security, cyber innovation versus protecting ourselves as a nation. And so it's a very interesting and developing area that requires important discussion, such as we're having this evening. And then the question is, what do we do about it? We need to be aware of the problem. We need to be prepared. What happens when the company is hacked? How do we respond? And then, when it happens, inevitably it will happen, to respond effectively. And that's where companies need to understand having incident response plans and being aware of how to do it. And I'm saying companies because to the extent that this is an issue affecting corporate America, but it also affects individuals. Expect that you will be hacked. Expect that that photograph from your grandmother is actually malware that's going into your computer. So obviously we all need to be vigilant, both on a personal level as well as on a corporate level, on a university level, and the government, because we too are vulnerable to attacks. There was a PricewaterhouseCoopers did a global state of information survey. In 2008, they said 83% of the respondents, corporate executives, said they were confident that their information security activities were effective. The confidence is wavering. It was more than 70% still in 2012 who said they felt confident. Similarly, last year, General Counsel magazine did a survey where around 83 or 85% of respondents said that they felt reasonably sure they could withstand an attack. But what we're seeing time and again, I beg to question those folks who are feeling that level of confidence. Because as we're seeing, these are systematic, regular attacks. They're affecting law firms, they're affecting companies, they're affecting individuals. We saw the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, all attacked. And it's not a question of whether you'll be attacked, it's a question of when. And on the company settings, that's a discussion that must be had. And it's something that affects the C-level, it's a C-suite, the senior officers in management, the boards of directors of the companies need to be aware. This is a very real problem. And obviously, there is always a question, especially now in these economic times, of where to put resources. But this is a place where you can lose a lot of money if the system isn't handled appropriately. And it's not a matter of just having a brilliant CTO or IT team. It's a matter of having a plan throughout the company to say, as good as your CSO is and your CTO, your chief security officer and your chief technology officer, there still will be flaws in the system. And we saw that recently with Bit9, which is a company whose job was to help with security systems. And RSA, another company who provides the codes for protecting computer systems, they also were hacked. And they also are vulnerable. And those are the guys who know how to do it. So it's a reality that we all are vulnerable. And then it's a question of what do you do about it and how are you prepared. We saw recently, as Brendan mentioned, the attacks on the financial institutions that really kicked up in September through January, and brokerages and insurers, corporations, major news outlets, universities. In the government, most recently was the US Sentencing Commission that was hacked. And as I mentioned, Bit9 was recently in the news. I think that was about a week or 10 days ago. The General Accounting Office reported 15,500 breaches of government agencies in 2011. And that was a 19% jump from the prior year. I'm afraid to ask what the 2012 stats are, but I trust they are not good. There was, in the Department of Defense in 2011, 24,000 sensitive files related to missile tracking and unmanned aerial devices were hacked. The government websites last year, including the White House, the CIA, the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Homeland Security. And we like to be the guys who keep everybody safe, but the reality is the cyber problem permeates throughout our society. McAfee does quarterly threats reports, and their second quarter report reported that in Q2 of last year, there was the largest malware rise in 4 years. It was 1.5 million increase in incidents from the prior quarter. And that includes drive-by downloads, targeting mobile, thumb drive corruptors, and password stealers. And Brendan made an interesting point in the slide that the technology really is changing. Right? You used to have to just worry about the box under your desk, but then people have laptops and people have phones that can do all sorts of great things. And companies are trying to encourage mobility and remote access and everybody available 24/7. But with all of that comes additional concerns that we're walking around with these little data devices that have all sorts of valuable information. And the people's ability to steal that information is getting more and more sophisticated, where basically you can just walk by somebody, you're in a crowded restaurant, and they have the ability to scoop off information that you have on your cell phone. So we have to be aware of all of that. McAfee's recent threats report that was released for the third quarter of last year said that database breaches reached an all-time high. So by Q3 of 2012, we had already surpassed the number of database breaches, and I want you to say that 10 times fast when I'm done, for the prior year. Again, the problem is growing. By Symantec's numbers, US companies are losing $250 billion to IP theft, and it goes across industry sectors. And then this is Symantec and McAfee. Now, the numbers are a little bit different. It depends how you look at them and what they're counting, but they said internationally on cybercrime, it's about $114 billion lost each year. And if you include the value of time and lost business opportunities, that number skyrockets. Add global remediation efforts, it gets into $1 trillion. And the daily targeted attacks continue to increase at a minimum rate of 24%. So it's 151 targeted attacks a day. That's a lot of attacks. And again, it's across sectors, and it's of varying degrees and varying types of problems. Interestingly, the attacks on small businesses have more than doubled. And that shows hackers are using the path of least resistance. On my team, the head of our cyber group, Erez Lieberman, is a former engineer. And so he likes to talk about the atoms finding the path of least resistance. And just like that, the hackers have said, why am I going to blow through the wall of the safe if I can just figure out how to open a window that someone has left open? So when companies are dealing with third-party vendors, with customers, with other users who we want to be friendly and have these great websites that everyone can access their accounts and access our system and be open and user-friendly. At the same time, there's the balance of creating vulnerabilities with everyone who can access our system. And so that's always the tension that we need to face, and the business decisions the companies need to make in terms of you don't want to just be a vault and not have anything helpful to your customers, but at the same time recognize whenever your vendors, your customers, and others can go on your site, it's potential opportunities for them to unknowingly often inject malware into your systems. Interestingly, 85% of, and this is the Verizon data breach investigations report from last year, said 85% of breaches took weeks to discover. 92% of incidents were discovered by a third party. 96% of victims had insufficient safeguards. In other words, there's stuff we could do to keep this from happening. And a lot of it, 79%, were targets of opportunity. And this one I found interesting. 96% of the attacks were not highly difficult. And there are some basic precautions that companies can put in place to protect from hacking. And it starts with the dialogue of understanding this is a very real problem, and it's something that needs to be addressed throughout the company. If a company has 50,000 employees, they need to think about data security for 50,000 people. And they need an incident response plan for when they do get hacked that affects 50,000 people. Who has access to what systems? Why are they accessing the whole system if they only need to access a certain part of a system, for example? And we've had cases like that where someone comes in for a certain job and realizes once they use their passcode, they can go throughout the system and take information. And they say, well, but my passcode let me go there. And so the companies need to be aware of keeping things that only on a need-to-know basis, only on a need-to-access. At the same time, balancing that you want to be friendly and make sure everyone can work together and get the information they need 24/7. Back to Mueller, in last spring, he said, we're losing money, we're losing data, we're losing ideas. Together, we must find a way to stop the bleeding. And interestingly, though, I think companies are still moving a little slowly toward that effect, as are we in government. And we're trying to work that out. But the survey from PwC this fall said 50% of the executives who responded understood that top-level leadership was still an obstacle to improving information security. And only 49% of the respondents had security training for the employees. Again, it goes to each employee. It goes to the low-level employee who has a computer and has an email account that is linked to the server and therefore has an opportunity to click on the email that says, hi, see my pictures from my trip to Madrid. And it's actually not vacation photos. It's something far more pernicious. And only 8% of the respondents to this survey had an overall information security strategy and had a chief information security officer who reported to the C-suite. And that's another issue of years. And when I started doing cybercrime and had oversight over it about 5 years ago, more often it was something that IT handled, the computer stuff. And then the executives handled other stuff. But over time, we've seen this changing dramatically in the last 2 to 4 years, where more and more it is getting C-suite level attention. But it's something that needs to happen throughout companies, because obviously it seems to be, at least according to this survey, not broadly recognized enough. And then who are they? And Brendan already talked a little bit about that, but we see fraudsters who are out to make money. We see predators who are out to get our kids through online crime. We see hacktivists who are going into systems to make a statement, to embarrass people, to publish different things, to hurt companies, to send a message. We see terrorists where that's a concern, and that's part of the national security interests that are addressed in today's New York Times and that Professor Waxman can speak to, and foreign intelligence services. So there are a lot of different folks who are doing this for a lot of different reasons. Some people are out to get money. as I mentioned, some to get children. Intellectual property is a major problem, both from outside perpetrators who are coming from other countries or other companies, as well as disgruntled employees. We see often intellectual property issues when someone's leaving the company and they start downloading all sorts of things that they think might help them in their next job or might help them get their next job. And sometimes we see them marketing company secrets to try to get the next job. Obviously, you would hope that an ethical subsequent employer would call that out, and sometimes they do, and we hear the reports from the subsequent employer. But other times, I think there may be people hired, and those aren't the calls we get. But with that, that's something that we see a lot in terms of the employees when they're leaving the company, or if there are bonus issues or promotions, or all of those things create a vulnerable time for a company where they need to be more aware of their data security. And then it goes back to the point of people should only have access to the information they need, and if they're ending their employment, to make sure that they are cut off from necessary access, which initially sounds kind of harsh, but in a practical sense, considering the risk to the company, is often necessary to take those measures. The supply chain is a big issue in terms of vulnerabilities throughout that. Sometimes people do it just to send a message, to recruit terrorists, and for all sorts of other reasons. Often, in our cases, we see two common defenses, and I did not make this up, but it's the Saudi defense, which is some other dude did it. And we hear that a lot. And so as part of our cases, we have to put the pieces together in terms of getting the internet logs and knowing who was there, and then being able to trace back who was at the house at the time and who was on there. And sometimes if you have visual pictures and other things, it helps. We had one case where a person used a credit card. They were being smart. They were using an air card thinking, well, now they won't find me because it's not tied to my house. And they were at a McDonald's and then used their credit card to buy more time and to access the Wi-Fi at the McDonald's. So we were able to put the pieces together. And then sometimes there's a Trojan horse, that it wasn't their computer. And there are times where really we will trace, or I've gotten a call from a victim to say, our company has been hacked, but my IT staff traced it and it's gone to these a computer in Texas. But then we find the computer in Texas is just some poor person who had their computer hacked by someone else who's actually overseas, which is where the money is by the time you trace back all the steps. So that's why it's also important from law enforcement perspective. We like to get involved very quickly because there are often many moving parts, and we're trying to trace back the perpetrators and their points of access. When we look through the type of evidence we look for, internet protocol logs, email searches, social networking sites, we learn a lot often from that. Data analysis, we can get pen registers and wire intercepts as well with court orders. We see phishing and hacking, corporate victims, often through fraud, identity theft, social engineering, and hacking. One example of a case we saw, United States versus Parklands, was a breach at the customer level. It wasn't the victim company or the banks, but it was a customer who had access to the company's systems, and someone was able to manipulate that customer and get access to the customer's computer to be able to attack the company and gain millions of dollars from the company. The spear phishing attacks, as Brendan referenced in his presentation, the New York Times article that today mentions at Coca-Cola how there was certain spear phishing. There is always the phishing attacks where they send emails to try to get an individual. Spear phishing is targeted to a certain person, often a high-level executive at a company who has significant access, where they want to try to get that person to click on an email or to give up, unknowingly usually give up information. We see, this is going back to May of 2011, but this was a major data breach, is the Sony breach. And I think there's a lot to learn from this one. IT World had an article that analyzed what was gained from the breach. And I think these are things, going back to that Verizon study where they said 96% were not complicated attacks. Here, they found that the customers' passwords were short, simple, and predictable. Now, in the government, at Department of Justice, I have so many different passwords for so many different things. I approve people's travel, I approve people's time, I approve case openings and other things getting into my system themselves. And my arms are not long enough to write all the passwords on, because we have to do different passwords, and then we have to change them however many days. It seems like every blink of an eye. And so then I have to wash my arm a lot of times to keep all those passwords straight. But there is a movement toward making sure that the passwords are more complex. I mean, what we saw in the Sony hack was that only 93% of the passwords had only 6 to 10 characters. And so that was easy to be able to cut into them and find out, to hack them. 99% were only letters or numbers, so they didn't have the symbols. You should put in exclamation points and stars and the things that the cartoons use as curse words. Add those to your passwords. It's helpful to prevent hackers when they have the databases that are just running through different codes to try to break your password. 64% existed in dictionaries of frequently used passwords. I love you. Well, actually, Brendan mentioned that as a way to inject a virus, but also it's still, words that are usable as passwords that people always use. So, there are things that I'm sure you've heard before, but you don't want to use your birthday or your kids' names or other things that are easily guessed by people who know you or easily figured out by other folks who can just run programs that will go through, well, a lot of people use these words or those words and these numbers. And so to the extent that you can have a password that admittedly is difficult to remember and annoying, it helps. And in the Sony case, the company made a significant error where they had the user names and passwords in plain text. Encryption is very helpful. So it's something where companies, it's human error where we're operating these things and mistakes happen. But that's something to keep in mind, that if you take care to have passwords, take care to lock them in encrypted codes. Gonzalez, this was a case that we prosecuted in New Jersey as well as with the Massachusetts. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts also had a case. This is still the largest data breach to date. It was 130 million records. And Gonzalez actually was initially arrested for ATM theft, and he became a government cooperator as part of a shadow crew investigation. I'll just run through it quickly, but the Secret Service shut down a website that had illegal carding, and they sent a message saying, we have now taken over this website. But then he was cooperating with the government and apparently living very large. These pictures are from a Rolling Stone magazine. They don't pay enough for these apartments on most government salaries, but he had that, and he was enjoying time on vacations, and because he was at the same time cooperating, also finding that he could make some more money on the side by engaging in further illegal activity, including picking Fortune 500 targets, hacking, stealing credit cards, and using those credit cards and selling those credit cards. And so they were using SQL injections, malware, recognizance of different networks to get in. They disabled victim logging. They were very good about erasing evidence and very sophisticated to try to conceal the scheme. But ultimately, there were 5 different victims where we found that putting the pieces together, and the Secret Service did a terrific job on this, in terms of seeing that there were similar SQL injection strings, and the IP address that got into the computers and got out were similar. And putting the dots together, realized that Albert Gonzalez was connected, along with some others, to these major attacks. And then there were certain chats that we were able to get where he talked about the illegal activity. And putting all that together, this is from a New York Times article that shows that there was an international web of how the information was stolen and then sent overseas and marketed to others for pernicious activity and money-making. So this was one of his houses that he had. He was indicted and is still the longest sentence to date for a hacker. He had 20 years and a day in the court in Boston. Emails need to be monitored. You want to watch out for social engineering. Advanced persistent threat. They keep trying and trying. It's advanced. It's persistent. It's more than a threat. It's a very real problem. And then there's nation-state hacking, which we can talk about. I'm just going to, as I mentioned, disgruntled employees or opportunistic employees. This was a guy who got fired, didn't like his severance package, said, you guys have an awful firewall. I'm going to hack you. I'm going to publish it. Your company will be done. A New York-based hedge fund. They called us right away. Of course, these calls come on a Friday night, but we were able to make consensual recording over the weekend, and by Monday morning, he was in custody because we had gotten him on tape making calls to his employer to discuss what it would cost them to make him, for him not to breach. We had another employee who was stealing files with chemical data as part of MP3 files. So the songs Satisfy You or the Thong Song or Got to Get It, these were actually not these songs, but secret company data that was hidden in this way so that when she left the country, it just looked like she had music for a long overseas plane ride. There was not music there. We were able to find something beyond that. Hyundai had a great story where it was not great that they were hacked, but the CEO did a nice article saying he worked with the authorities. It was very helpful. Being transparent as a company is good. Learning IT and vulnerabilities. And really the bottom line is recognizing it's not just an IT issue. It's a corporate-wide issue that senior management and everyone in the company needs to be aware of. And so I don't want to overuse our time because I know Professor Waxman has more to say and Jesse has some questions for us, but that's just an overview of some of what we're seeing from the government. It's a real problem, it's a serious problem, and we need to work together to take care of it. Thank you.
Thank you. So Matthew, what should the government be doing about all of this? Or what it can do about all of this?
I'm actually here to present more questions and problems than answers. But thanks for the opportunity to address this audience. And my opening remarks here will pick up on what the other speakers have said. And in the end, I'll try to talk a little bit about some solutions. But that's really not my specialty. I want to talk about several cybersecurity challenges, and especially at the intersection of law and policy. And my overarching argument is this, that on the one hand, I think the borderless features of cyberspace, the empowerment by cyber technologies of individuals and non-state groups may seem to suggest that individual states are not, as is usually customary, the key actors to focus on when thinking about where law and policy are heading in this area. And I think there is some truth to that. On the other hand, though, at least at present, I think it's important to think about individual states, their features, in order to try to understand where law and policy are heading in this area, because I think the directions of both domestic and international law with regard to cybersecurity will be driven by individual states' own mixes of politics, strategy, culture, technology, and other features, at least for a while. So let me give some examples of that. In terms of domestic cybersecurity law and policy, I think some of the big looming questions include things like how to protect our critical infrastructure, how much and how to share information between the government and the private sector with regard to the kinds of cyber threats that we've heard about already. These protection of critical infrastructure, information sharing between the public and private sector, these were among the major topics that were covered by the recent executive order that Judith mentioned, that were the subject last year of some proposed legislation that was pushed by some members of Congress as well as the White House, but failed to pass. Other questions like what legal authorities should be allocated to which government departments and agencies, or should they be allocated to government departments and agencies? How should we allocate liability for major cybersecurity breaches or incidents? Another hot one these days is what kinds of self-help remedies are available to private companies, individuals who are subject to cyber attacks. To what extent can they attack back as part of their defensive strategy, especially if they feel that the government is not adequately protecting them from cyber attacks? Now, that was a menu of what I see as some hot public policy questions, and many countries, the United States is certainly having a difficult time wrestling with these issues. Many countries are, and I think some of the obstacles to resolving them favorably are pretty generic. They're problems that all states, all governments face. Things like the technical attribution problems that we heard about, that it may be difficult to, once you identify an attack, to actually trace back the forensics to the ultimate, to the original perpetrator of that attack. That may be difficult. We're talking about an area of public policy here in which the technology is moving and evolving very, very rapidly. One thing about law is law doesn't always evolve all that quickly. It's a process of legislation, process on the international plane of making treaties or customary law. These are slow processes, but technology, especially in these areas, moves quickly. So these are some generic problems to dealing with these kinds of challenges. But I think some of the challenges to dealing with them are special or unique to particular countries or particular governments. Here in the United States, among the particular challenges or special features of our system include the fact that most of our digital infrastructure, including the critical infrastructure that keeps our government, our society, our economy functioning, is in private hands. Right? These are telecommunications industry, for example, power companies. These are private corporations. We also here in the United States have generally, at least today, a quite anti-regulatory a political culture. So there's going to be resistance to almost any solution to these problems that's labeled as regulatory. Civil liberties and distrust of government. Judith talked a little bit about this. Americans are especially sensitive about government access to their data and communications, especially access by some government agencies like the National Security Agency, that's probably the most capable in these areas, as well as other government departments like the Department of Homeland Security. Americans tend to be very distrustful of the government coming in and collecting, analyzing their data. This actually contrasts with many other democracies, including, for example, West European countries, where citizens tend to be more concerned than Americans are about corporate access. Company access to their data. Right here in the United States, we care a lot about whether the government is collecting and monitoring our data, but we routinely, freely give it out to companies all the time. Right? We are, every time we send an email, we're essentially giving that content of that to a company, and few of us probably read the terms of service in doing so. Right? But if we said, why don't you turn the content of your email over to the government, we'd freak out at the thought of that. Another aspect, again, that's at least somewhat special to the United States is many of our large corporations in this area are global corporations. The tech sector in the United States is not only private, but it tends to be global, meaning for many big corporations in this area, their most significant customers may be huge markets in places like China, Russia, et cetera. What this means is oftentimes the interests of the private sector and the government are not going to be perfectly or even well aligned when it comes to trying to deal with cybersecurity problems. All of these factors, like I say, have conspired to make cybersecurity legislation or major radical public policy changes here in the United States very difficult, or made it difficult even to coordinate, I think, a serious cybersecurity strategy at the national level. In that regard, I think the recent executive order that Judith mentioned represents more of a failed effort than a serious effort on the part of the federal government to take a robust and aggressive approach to cybersecurity. I think most of the things that were announced recently by the president in this executive order are not likely to seriously improve cybersecurity. That's my own editorial view, and we can chat about that during the Q&A. So far I've been talking about public policy and law, legal reform at the national level, what about at the international level? Just as at the domestic level, I listed some big questions that I think are looming. There are big questions at the international legal level as well, including how to govern and regulate the internet. What are the appropriate international legal regimes for dealing with cybercrime, cyber espionage, cyber attacks, each of which I think is quite different. What are the rights of self-defense that states have against cyber attacks? For example, when does a state have a right to respond militarily to cyber attacks that may be perpetrated against the government or even against corporations and individuals within a country? Again, I think as at the domestic level, some of these issues involve some generic problems that all states have to deal with. The rapid pace of technological change, difficulties of precise and timely attribution of cyber attacks. But some of them, I think, are also specific challenges that vary from state to state, country to country, because, again, interests are not always well aligned in these areas. I think the views of different states, different countries in the international system will vary considerably based on what they consider, these individual states consider to be the primary threats in cyberspace. To take just as an example, to compare the United States and China. For the United States, I think we tend to think in terms of cybersecurity. We want to make sure that we protect the free flow of data over our digital infrastructure, and we want to maintain the integrity of that flow of information. For China, they think more in terms of information security. They're worried about the content of some information that's flowing over the internet. They're worried about the political and, for them, what they see as national security implications of free flow of information over the internet and other digital infrastructure. So our interests are not aligned because we see different strategic problems. Different states will take different positions on these international legal questions because they have different vulnerabilities and different forms of power. The United States, we've talked about, both the previous speakers have, cyber attack. Both speakers have talked about the kinds of cyber threats that we face, and the United States, as has been shown, is quite vulnerable to various kinds of cyber attacks. At the same time, the United States is also immensely powerful in some traditional ways, militarily, economically, but also in some new ways. The United States has some very, very powerful offensive cyber attack capabilities of its own that have been on display reportedly in Iran, for example, with regard to Stuxnet and some other reported cyber attacks that have been linked to the United States government. So I think, where does all this lead? Let me conclude with the following sort of takeaway, that I think with regard to formal law, formal reform of our public policy and regulation in this area, whether we're talking about statutes passed by Congress, regulations promulgated by individual departments or agencies, treaties negotiated among states, or customary international law worked out over time through state practice, I think we're likely to see continued kind of legal incrementalism. I don't see anytime soon any major, bold, radical reform. On the other hand, though, or in addition to that, I'm not sure that's such a bad thing, in that I think I think some incrementalism may be sort of the best response to an area which is evolving so quickly because the technology is changing so much, and I think addressing the kinds of challenges that I've talked about may require some new forms of governance, including new types of cooperation between public and private sectors, as opposed to the more traditional forms of regulating dangerous threats, whether in the physical space or elsewhere.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. I want to thank my panel for a wonderful discussion this evening. Judith, thank you very much. Matthew and Brendan, thank you all. Give them a round of applause, please. I would like to thank the Richman Center for their support, and Kathleen for her support in putting this together, and Joshua for his support too and help. I want to thank all of you for attending tonight, so thank you.